afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats. I'm Jim Glassman. I'm a visiting fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, where I work with the Center for Internet Communications and Technology Policy, which was launched about a year ago. Now includes, I believe it's 13 or 14 fellows. We put out tech policy daily. We do conferences like this one. This is the first in a series, and we're extremely happy to have Peter Thiel as our first interviewee. Let me introduce Peter before we get down to the questions, and we want to hear from you, of course, when we're finished. Peter Thiel was born in Germany. His family moved to the United States when he was an infant. He was a great young chess player. He was a big reader of science fiction. He went to Stanford, got his bachelor's degree in philosophy, and then to Stanford Law School. And then, as he relates in his new book, 0 to 1, which is a terrific book, he was luckily turned down as in his desire to be a Supreme Court clerk. He then did work at a law firm, then went to Wall Street. And then in the late 90s, he co-founded PayPal, which was eventually sold to eBay. He became the first outside investor in Facebook, where he's on the board. He founded a macro hedge fund, and then several venture funds, including Founders Fund. And through Founders and by himself, he has invested in such tech companies as SpaceX, LinkedIn, Yelp, and Spotify. He's also the co-founder and the largest investor in Palantir, which is one of the leading big data companies that provides platforms for financial companies and the U.S. intelligence community, and we'll talk about that as well. Peter is deeply involved in causes around the general subject of freedom, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, including marijuana legislation or anti-legislation. He's pro-marijuana legislation. He's the largest financial supporter, although, as he'll tell you, or as he says in the book, he doesn't necessarily partake himself. He is the largest financial supporter, or was at any rate, of Ron Paul. Tyler Cowen, whom many of us know and respect, calls Peter one of the leading public intellectuals of our time. He's rated a master in chess. He's co-produced the film Thank You for Smoking. And as I said, he's just published an excellent book. Also, people say that he is the model for Peter Gregory, the somewhat eccentric billionaire on Silicon Valley on HBO. Don't know whether that's true or not. I do want to say before we start that we will be distributing his book to all of you, and Peter has generously agreed to sign books afterwards, although he does have a kind of a hard deadline, so we'll get there really quickly. So Peter, we're really happy to have you here. You can tell there's a lot of excitement in the air. You're the first interviewee of a series that we call The Disruptors, but I have to say that in reading your book, we were trying to be with it, and we know what's going on, so we called it The Disruptors. But I read your book, and in your book you say that you're not crazy about that term. In fact, you have one chapter heading, Don't Disrupt. I thought that might be a good place to start. So are we wrong to talk about you as a disruptor?
Well, I'm always skeptical of all the sort of standard categories people put in. Let me just back up. One of the challenges in writing a business book or in teaching about entrepreneurship is that I think there are two normal ways people write these books. One is that you tell idiosyncratic autobiographical stories, like this is what I did at PayPal in 1999 when we combined email and money, and that's not really that interesting to people. So they're maybe exciting war stories, but you can't really learn that much from it because you're not going to be able to do the same thing today. And then I think the other mode for business books tends to be sort of at the other end of the spectrum, and it's basically a pseudo-scientific formula where you follow these 5 steps and you will have a successful company. And I'm also very skeptical of that because I think I think there is actually no formula for great businesses. Every moment in business only happens once. And so, the next Bill Gates won't start an operating system company. The next Mark Zuckerberg won't start a search engine. If you're copying these people, you're in some sense not learning from them. What my book tries to do is sort of do something where you do neither the anecdotal story nor the pseudoscientific formula, and instead really think about how do you do these sort of one-of-a-kind things. And so one of the things I'm skeptical of throughout the book are these sort of somewhat banal-sounding categories people use. And so the disruptor category is one such thing where, if you think about sort of like a disruptive kid in elementary school gets sent to the principal's office. A disruptive person is someone who looks for trouble and finds it most of the time. And disruptive companies do get noticed, but they normally don't succeed. Sort of a classic disruptive company in Silicon Valley in the late 90s was Napster, which set out to disrupt the entire music industry. They were on the front page of Time magazine one year. The next year, they were shut down by the government. And if you have a name like Napster, you nap some music, you nap a kid. Maybe it's not you're certainly a disruptive sort of person, but that's not what you actually want to be doing. The idea of disruption as an issue goes back to Clay Christensen, who wrote this book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which I think it was a really good book, but it was written from the perspective of big companies, where big companies need to worry about the problem of disruption. And somehow it got sort of transmogrified into this thing that startups should try to do in one way or another, and I think that that's always a problem. The general touch point in my book is you should try to do things that are unique. You should build monopolies. You should not be competing with other people, and if you're disrupting, then you're already defining yourself by an existing industry, by trying to be close to someone else. You're already defining yourself in an overly competitive way. You don't want to be building the 4th online pet food company. You don't want to build the 10th thin film solar panel company. You don't want to open a restaurant in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else. And you want to build unique, one-of-a-kind businesses. And so disruption, I think, automatically already gets you into the wrong frame of mind.
But you do agree with Christensen's idea that you try to find some kind of small, especially low-cost kind of niche to start at. And I think you point out in the book, Amazon Jeff Bezos wanted to take over the world, certainly. That was his plan, but he started small with books. He thought that would be a good little niche.
Yeah, I think you always want to start with, I would say not necessarily low cost, but I would say small markets. Mm-hmm. So if the goal is to have a monopoly, when you start a small company, you get to a monopoly quickly by taking over a small market fast. It's very hard for a small company to take over a big market fast. And so, for example, I know Facebook had an auspicious start. Its initial market was 10,000 kids at Harvard. It went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. That's a good start. PayPal started with eBay power sellers, which was not that big a market in late 99, early 2000. It's about 20,000 power sellers. We got to about 30% market share in about 3 months. One of the things, this monopoly perspective leads me to think that one of the most common mistakes people make is to go after really big markets. I have a whole chapter on everything that went wrong with the clean tech companies in the last decade, and I think it's sort of, and it was sort of the failure was very overdetermined. They made there's sort of 7 different types of mistakes that I list that companies make. You should get 7 out of 7 right. You'll have a good chance of succeeding. They mostly got 0 out of 7. And so if they'd even, if they've gotten one of the things right, they would have still made 6 other like nearly fatal mistakes. But one of the fatal mistakes they almost all made was the markets were too big. Every PowerPoint presentation from a clean tech company you saw started, first slide, we're in the energy market. This is a market measured in trillions or hundreds of billions of dollars. It's a really big market. And then you are a minnow in a vast ocean, and you are competing not just with the other 10 thin film solar panel companies, but then with the other 90 solar panel companies, and then with wind and with coal and with fracking comes out of right field and Chinese manufacturing comes out of left field, and you go out of business. And so you want to start with really small markets.
But you did with PayPal. You wanted your goal was to create a new currency for for the United States. So it wasn't, that's a pretty big market, right?
I think you want to have, it's very good to have an ambitious sense of mission, to have some transformative goal, to be focused on some important substantive questions. So it was very interesting in the question of cryptocurrency, could one change the nature of money? And even though I think we had this, our T-shirt had the slogan, "The New World Currency," we did not quite succeed in building it. It was all still just dollars and other standard fiat forms of money. But it was a set of, but by thinking about some deep problems linked to the nature of money, it got us to building a payment system that worked much better than some of the other things that people had built. So I do think a substantive focus where you think really hard about some of these bigger things is very inspiring and very powerful. I don't know, my colleague from PayPal, Elon Musk, who started SpaceX, the goal is to get people to Mars. It may take a while to get there, but in the meantime, they're building a fantastic rocket business.
And you pointed out in the book, just on PayPal, that the 6 co-founders, 4 of them were 23 or under. 3 of them, or 4, I guess 4 of them.
5 were 23 under, 4 built bombs in high school.
Right, 4 built bombs, and
2
4
were living in
they
communist
didn't.
countries.
They didn't actually test the bombs, did they?
We didn't really get into that many details on it.
But 4 of them were born in other countries.
Yes.
3 of them in communist countries.
2 were 3 from communist countries. No, so we had sort of a, it's always a question when you start these companies. You have these often fairly extreme personalities that drive them, and I do think that starting one of these businesses is not sort of something people conventionally do in all these ways. And I think there are both some benefits and some risks to having these extreme personalities drive these companies. I'm a big fan of founder-led businesses. I think there's always a risk that as companies get bigger, they become more bureaucratic, more sclerotic. I'm sort of more libertarian politically, so I always think there's this vast gulf between the private and public sector. But I do think that there are points where large corporations sometimes seem to be much like the government, and I think that's something you always want to try to resist. And I think that founder-led companies are able to continue to stay focused and push the envelope. And I think this was, you sort of look at the founder-led internet companies today, they're Amazon, Google, Facebook. I think they are somehow far more innovative than the non-founder-led ones, which might be, say, eBay or Yahoo or Microsoft at this point.
So do you think it was a mistake for Bill Gates to leave Microsoft?
It's hard to know if it's a mistake, but my interpretation of it would be that it's like an insider telling us that he's out of ideas, that he doesn't know anything fun. There's nothing fun left to do. Maybe there was nothing fun because the government had come after Microsoft in the 90s. But that I think Gates sort of voted with his feet and was sort of saying that there was that he didn't have many exciting things left to do, and I think that's what that accurately signaled, that he was going to have more fun with philanthropy than with technology.
One of the things I found interesting in your book is, even though you're a libertarian and a crockery breaker, you're a big believer in planning, and that's kind of a myth that you shatter in the book, that we just start a company and see what happens.
Yes, well, it's there's a lot to say on this, but I certainly think that one of the most critical things in all these technology companies is that much of the value exists quite far in the future. We did this exercise at PayPal in March of 2001. What's the discounted cash flow valuation of the business? And we'd been in business for only 27 months. You had sort of very high growth rate. There was a pretty high discount rate, but it turned out that 3/4 of the market cap of the value of PayPal came from profits we were going to be earning in years 2011 and beyond as of 2001. And this is sort of the math that's true of all these companies. If you look at Alibaba, Facebook, Twitter, 3/4 or more of their market capitalizations come from profit streams they'll be earning in the mid-2020s and beyond. And so one of the things we always tend to be, I think, overweight in Silicon Valley and either as investors or founders of these companies is the growth rates, which is the part you can measure. And whereas the variable that's actually much bigger is the durability. It's the question, will this company still be around a decade from now, 2 decades from now? People always talk about being the first mover. I think it's more important to be the last mover. You know, if you get in the chess analogy, so if you're the first mover, you play white. You get it's an advantage of about 1/3 of a pawn. The last mover, you say checkmate, you win, game over. It's the world champion Capablanca had this line, you know, you must begin by studying the end game. And so I think with all these businesses, it's always an important question, what does the end game look like? And if you say, well, no idea what the end game looks like. The future is so far in the future, and everything's changing so fast in technology, you can't know. Then that's sort of, I think, setting you up for things going wrong. And certainly, like the clean tech companies would say, "Oh, we had no idea that we were going to be beaten by China," and you know, maybe that was a very hard thing to figure out. But I think if we're sort of lazy and don't try to think about it, then we end up saying it's all random and all chance. So I do think a bad plan is always better than having no plan, and it's something, you know, it's something worth thinking about. Now, on the yeah, so I could go on that, but.
No, I was going to say one more thing about planning, because at AEI we also do national security, and you wrote in your book, if you think political leaders have plans and are thinking about the future, well, it may be true of Putin. Oh, actually, I think this was in an interview. It may be true of Putin and the Chinese leadership, but that's about it. The shocking thing is that there is no plan at all.
Yes, and so there's an ideological libertarian cut on this, which is that government can't plan things and shouldn't plan things. And I'm sympathetic to that in some way, but I think it's always worth keeping in mind a certain historical perspective where this is not an eternal truth. And there was a time when our government actually was able to plan things better. You were able to get a Manhattan Project, and in 3.5 years you could build a nuclear bomb. Or in the 1960s, you could do Apollo and you could get to the moon within a decade. And whereas today, we're sort of living in a time when, you know, you sort of get a sense that a letter from Einstein to the White House would get lost in the mailroom, you know, and you know, I realize we say ideologically the government can't do anything, but even as a hardcore libertarian, I would not have thought that the Obamacare website wouldn't work. That was not something I predicted, because I do think, and I think building a website that works is much easier than building a functioning nuclear bomb.
Okay, I want to get.
And you know, there was the New York Times. The New York Times op-ed a few days after Hiroshima said, you know, I'm going to sort of paraphrase this, but it was basically for all those. This shows how much science can achieve when it's organized by the government and led by the army. For those who say that, you know, it's true that maybe if you'd let prima donna scientists up to themselves, they could have figured this out over 50 years. But, you know, as a result of the army telling the scientists what to do, we got this invention in 3 short years. They don't write op-eds like that at the New York Times anymore.
I want to get to your discussion in the book of definite optimism, indefinite pessimism, because I think that it is fascinating. But you brought up the government, so let me bring up a topic that we're very concerned about here at AEI, and especially at the center, and that is net neutrality. So you said this the other day, we've had these debates about net neutrality for over 15 years. It hasn't been necessary so far, and I'm not sure anything has changed to make it necessary right now. And I don't like government regulation. We need the U.S. government to regulate the internet about as much as we need the EU to regulate Google. I suspect the cons greatly outweigh the pros. So do you have any more comments on the government's role vis-a-vis the internet?
Well, you know, I think that sort of summarizes my views pretty well. I think that I think there are all these theoretical arguments for regulation. There is an argument that Comcast and Verizon, maybe they are sort of monopolies of not a good sort, of a bad sort. They're monopolies that are acting just as toll collectors or rent collectors. And these are the classic kinds of things where you do want the government to step in. But the history of government involvement with technology has been quite bad. I think the whole antitrust thing against IBM, with 2020 hindsight, feels like it was completely unnecessary because things were shifting to software and away from IBM already in the 70s and definitely by the early 80s. The Microsoft antitrust thing, I suspect, was counterfactually unnecessary because I think Microsoft would have lost ground in the age of the internet with or without the government doing it. And so, because technology there's been enough dynamism and enough change in computer technology that we don't need to worry about these. If you were to have a sort of a bad monopoly for the next 100 years and nothing was going to change, and we knew this for certain, maybe you could get the government to come in. But I don't think the history has been much more dynamic than that. And so I think they've gotten it wrong many times before. And then, even more generally, I've often said that, over the last 45 years in the US, we've had a lot of innovation in the world of bits, computers, internet, mobile internet, that whole ensemble of things. We've had much less innovation in the world of atoms, energy, transportation, space travel, underwater cities, all the kinds of things that people in the 1950s and 60s would have thought would have happened. And the question why you have this sort of dualistic economy where there's innovation in the world of information but not in the world of matter is, I think, a really important one for us to think about. The straightforward explanation I would give is that we live in a world in which bits are relatively unregulated and in which atoms are very heavily regulated. And so we have
Jeff Eisenach smiling back there.
So
that's his line.
So if you had I don't know. So for example, if the FDA decided that it was going to start looking at video games and seeing whether they did damage to people's brains, were they addictive, and what sort of effect did they have on your brains, you would have far less innovation in video game technology than you've had before. And so I've always suggest the counterfactual thought experiment is think about what would happen if the FDA was regulating video games.
And in general, you're not a big fan of the FDA.
Yeah, I know. I think it's. I'm not. I think there are probably other things that have gone wrong with the biotech industry in recent decades. But certainly, when it costs on the order of $1 billion to bring a new drug to market, that creates a barrier to entry that's very different from, say, $120,000, which is what it costs to start a software company through Y Combinator. And so when you have something that's 4 or 5 orders of magnitude more expensive, I think that does materially change the dynamics of what people do in business.
So actually,
4 orders of magnitude.
This is probably a good time to talk about your concept of optimism and pessimism, because I think it relates to innovation and our attitudes toward innovation. So could you just lay that out for us?
Well, again, there's sort of a lot of different ideas around this, but I think that there sort of are. I sort of draw this out as a 2x2 matrix. You can be optimistic or pessimistic, and then you can have sort of definite or indefinite ideas of the future. And I think that for many decades we've been in this sort of what I describe as this optimistic indefinite quadrant in the U.S., where we think the future is going to get better, but we can't precisely describe how it gets better. And that's a world that gets dominated by law and finance. What matters is the processes that you have, and it does not involve sort of any sort of concrete ideas about how to actually make the future better. For a variety of reasons that I go through in my book, I think the sort of indefinite optimistic paradigm has sort of run into a dead end of sorts, and the most natural way it sort of devolves is towards what I call indeterminate pessimism, where people become pessimistic about the future but don't know what to do. And I think this is sort of what characterizes Japan, Western Europe, where people think the future sort of will get worse but have no idea what to do. And what I would like us to find a way is to get back to more definite optimism, where we think about what do we want the future to look like, how do we accomplish that. I don't think it's something we do on a governmental level, but I think it's something you do in the context of starting new businesses and new ventures of one sort or another. One sort of financial way to get at some of the paradoxes around indefinite optimism is that is that in a world of indefinite optimism, people tend to end up valuing money more than anything they can possibly do with it, because people are sort of out of ideas. You try to get money, you try to always have liquidity, and then money's pure optionality. You can do anything you want with it. And I think one of the very odd things that's going on is that you have these interest rates that are 0, -2%, and all these corporations, all the institutions in the U.S. still don't know what to do with their money. I had this debate with Eric Schmidt, the Google chairman, 2 years ago in Aspen, and Google normally gets critiqued for having too many weird, flaky projects of one sort or another. And I sort of took the opposite tack, where you have $50 billion in cash. Bernanke, now Yellen, is giving you -2% real interest on your cash. They're begging you to do something with money, just do anything with it. Innovate, do something more. And the fact that you're sitting on $50 billion in cash is proof that you're out of ideas. And since Google gets attacked for having too many ideas, by transitivity, it's sort of proof of how badly we're out of ideas across the board. And so I do think there was this conservative critique of the deficits and the quantitative easing in 2009, 2010, that I think we really need to think about a lot harder why it didn't realize. And the critique was, you're going to have interest rates go through the roof. It's going to be this enormous crowding out of money. If the government's borrowing $1 trillion a year, it will crowd out all this money from the private sector. The interest rates are going to go up like crazy. And this has not happened over the last 5 years. And the somewhat disturbing answer that I would give as to why it has not happened is that people don't have any ideas of what to do with their money. And maybe there's a micro-regulatory problem, that a lot of ideas that would work are actually illegal, so you can't invest in all sorts of things. Maybe it's a cultural problem where we sort of think of the future as a problem that other people solve, and we've been trained not to have any ideas about it. But I think it's some combination of this legal, cultural context where one of the big predictions conservatives made, that interest rates were going to go through the roof because of QE and the government borrowing, have not happened. And I would say the reason it hasn't happened is because we're sort of weirdly out of ideas.
And so part of it is cultural. One of the things you say is that the line of demarcation was like 1971 or 69 or something. So Woodstock, it was Woodstock and putting man on the moon.
We landed on the moon in July '69. Woodstock started 3 weeks later, and and with the benefit of hindsight, we could perhaps say that that's sort of when progress ended and the hippies sort of took over the country, or something like that. Well, it's look. I think I'm in favor of it as a civil libertarian. I don't like it as a reflection of our society. So I think that I think prohibition, it was a good thing to end prohibition in the 1930s, but prohibition ended in the 1930s because people were unemployed and there was nothing better for them to do than to get drunk all the time. And whereas in the 1920s, there was a lot of great work to be done, and so you couldn't have a hangover in the morning. And I think if you look at the sort of the drug war over the last 100 years, Nancy Reagan, just say no to drugs. That happens in the 1980s when people are very optimistic. You legalize marijuana in a society where people are more pessimistic. So I'm in favor of it as a libertarian. But I don't like what it says about the general pessimism of our society.
And you talk in the book about self-medication or something, that the way that we ended up at legalization or almost legalization of marijuana was through medical marijuana, and that's apt because the people are using it.
Yes, it's not a fig leaf. It's all medical.
Right. Good point. So let me just ask you about one more thing, because we're already having questions shouted out from the audience. So obviously people want to ask questions, but I just did want to talk a little bit about the Teal Fellows, where you offer young people $100,000 to drop. Some people would say to drop out of college and start a business, and you've been criticized for that. This is subversive. Why shouldn't everyone just stay in college like Bill Gates did, I guess? But Why don't you tell us about the concept behind the Teal Fellows?
Well, it's sort of. We had sort of some discussions. We were talking about why are not more people going into these innovative businesses, starting new things. And I think one of the big challenges is a lot of people who graduate from college end up with very large amounts of student debt. And so there is, student debt has surpassed $1 trillion in the last few years. And once you start life with that much debt, it often constrains the kinds of things you can do. And so we thought that we'd offer this alternative program. We're in our 4th year. We've had about 20 people a year, 83 total, have gone through or started this 2-year program. They've raised about $60 million collectively in venture capital. There are sort of 3 or 4 of the businesses are tracking towards solid 100 million plus valuations, and I think the program as a whole has has triggered a much bigger debate about education than I thought. I initially thought it was just this very narrowly conceived program, but it sort of hit a very raw nerve because there is some sense that we've sort of put all our eggs in one basket. That and it's a form of indefinite optimism about the future. We have no idea what the future will be. We have no idea what we're going to do. So we'll get a degree. What will you do with the degree? You don't know, but you'll have options. What are the options? You don't know, but there'll be lots of good options. Can't be any more specific than that ever. And so I do think that we have a education bubble today that is as distorted and crazy as the housing bubble of the last decade. It's maybe even more hidden. The housing bubble was at its core sort of a middle class phenomenon, and the elite media and the institutions that inform thinking in our society are sort of upper middle class. And so throughout the housing bubble, there was some coverage about the insanity of people in Phoenix and Las Vegas, and look at all those dumb people buying those houses. There was always a little bit of an anti-housing bubble narrative. It's inconceivable for the media to give an anti-education narrative because the upper middle class is at the core of this education bubble, and so there's absolutely no critical distance from this. And it's certainly I went to an elite university, Stanford, undergrad Stanford Law, and it's hard to understate how much of our identity gets wrapped up in the universities we went to. It's this tournament you win early on. It's one of my friends who went to Yale. The freshman orientation, the dean told them, "Congratulations, you got into Yale. You're set for life." It's probably not true if you believe it, but I think we have to do better than this. You go to Yale or you go to jail mindset that we currently have.
Great. Okay, we're opening the floor to questions, and so if you have a question, raise your hand. Somebody will come to you with a microphone and will tell us who you are, and I'll get to you. Don't worry.
I'm Todd Fox. I work for Visa, and my question has to do with vertical progress and cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin, does that meet your definition of vertical progress?
Yeah, no. Bitcoin is a sort of an extraordinary sort of breakthrough innovation, and it's definitely meets that criterion. The question of whether it will work yet or not is, I think, still a little bit up in the air. So at PayPal, we thought about creating a new currency, and we ended up creating a new payment system. Our T-shirt said the new world currency. Bitcoin, I think, you've actually succeeded in creating a new currency, at least on the level of speculation, but the payment system part of it does not work that well, and so it's actually kind of hard to use in a transactional context. And so I think the thing that I would like to see develop over the next year or two for me to become more bullish on Bitcoin would be the payment system really starting to work for not just really crazy illegal transactions, but for everyday legal payments.
Back there, Travis.
Sorry, actually, my name is Travis Whirl. I work with Jim over at PAE, and my question was going to be on Bitcoins also. And it was going to be, how do you think that they'll survive with all the various levels of government and international governments regulating them in different ways?
Well, the bearish bearish argument on Bitcoin is that it will get outlawed by the government eventually. One of the sort of cryptocurrencies that I encountered early on at PayPal was one called eGold, which it had sort of these anonymous encrypted gold certificates that you could redeem anywhere in the world. And it was sort of somewhat of a scam-like company. People used stolen money to buy the gold certificates. We connected them up to PayPal. We realized all the money was stolen. We disconnected them 3 months later. They sued us for libel, sort of a little bit attenuated when I said that they were a sketchy company, so then we got sued for libel. We set, in late 01, I settled the libel suit in 02 for a few $100,000, and then in 08, the FBI arrested all of them, and they all went to jail. And so,
Did you get your money back?
No, of course not. So the moral of the story is, that, and I think Bitcoin is, it's gotten a lot further than e-gold has, or than any of these things have. But I think if we had a well-functioning government in this country, then you could draw a lot of reassurance from the fact that the government has not yet gone after Bitcoin. You can say, well, okay, if it's bad, we shut it down. But I think we have a very poorly functioning government, and so it's quite possible they will sort of decide slowly over the next 10 or 15 years to do something. And so I think you are in the zone of incredible uncertainty as to what's going to happen.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. But wait for the microphone. So speaking of libel suits, you said about Twitter, they have a lot of potential. It's a horribly managed company. Probably a lot of pot smoking going on there. Did you get much of a reaction to that?
Well,
By the way, I agree with you.
just to be clear, I didn't blame the management for smoking pot, and I didn't get any pushback on the accuracy of the statements. The Costello, the CEO, and which I thought was actually quite funny, he sort of just tweeted that he couldn't comment. He was busy eating a large bag of Doritos.
But the horribly managed company part.
Well, it's no, look, you have it's the more, there's always some nuance to these things. The nuance often gets lost. So the nuance on this is that it's a fantastic business model. And so when you have these fantastic business models, you can often get away with it being horribly mismanaged. If you're opening a restaurant, you have no margin for error. You have to do everything right. You have to be on top of every penny, how it gets spent. If you have this fantastic idea that's very hard, that once you have it, it grows really fast, it's hard for anyone to copy and ever catch up with you, then there's a lot more range of how well or badly the company gets run internally. And so Twitter is sort of on the end of pretty badly run, and it oddly doesn't matter.
That actually reminds me of something Warren Buffett said a long time ago, which was that you want to invest in a company that's such a great idea, such a great business that any idiot can run it because someday an idiot will. And I'm not saying that's about Twitter, but okay. So go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Sean Molly. I run a joint called Less Government. My question to you with regard to once upon a time the government could marshal their forces and accomplish a big thing, and now they can't. My question was, one, to a lesser degree, it was the military that was in charge of it, which I think organizes out of chaos better than most other arms of the government. And two, do you think it's because the government is trying to do so many things now compared to 50 years ago when they said, okay, we're going to the moon, that they get dissipated and distracted and they can't marshal their forces around a single project like they could back then?
Yes. No, I definitely think there is this sort of military push for innovation that is an important thread in the history of innovation that tends to be given, I think, somewhat short shrift. So I think it played played an enormous role, obviously, in Manhattan. You could say even Apollo was driven by the need to figure out faster ways to deliver the nuclear bombs to the other side, and that perhaps it's sort of maybe you could sort of date it collapsed in 1975 when you had the Apollo-Soyuz docking. If we're just going to be friends with the Soviets, why should you be working around the clock to build more effective weapons? I do think that there's something about the nuclear issue which had this very strange delayed effect. And so one of the reasons I think people have sort of turned against science and technology is that starting in the 1970s, there was a sense that nuclear weapons were quite bad. Can you motivate people to build more effective weapons if we already have thermonuclear bombs? And so even though I think historically that was a big motivator, I don't know. I don't know if it will motivate us in the future. And so, the syllogism I would say is that, working on the future requires you to make sacrifices in the present. To make certainly war, extreme circumstances like that are things that motivate extreme amounts of sacrifice. And that's sort of how you have this link. But once you have nuclear weapons, maybe this whole thing breaks down. We have to find a way for people to make sacrifices for the future that are not directly motivated by war. And we don't know how to do that.
I'm going to interrupt the questions for 1 second because I promised to talk about Palantir, and I don't want to miss it. So Palantir is a big data company, much praised, and among other things, you can, according to your website, military customers can piece together fingerprints on artillery shell fragments, location data, anonymous tips, and social media to track down Afghani bomb makers. Palantir supposedly had something to do with tracking down Osama bin Laden, and I think you said a few days ago that it helped in thwarting a terrorist attack. But and I'll get to that. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but before that, you are critical of the notion that there's a debate over government, in the debate over government access to personal information, that it's really a trade-off. Everybody talks about it. It's a trade-off between security and civil liberties. And you say, as a libertarian, it is critical to develop technology like this, meaning Palantir-type technology, actually in order to protect civil liberties. So could you just expand on that concept?
Well, yeah, and people constantly are talking about this. They always frame it as a trade-off of security versus privacy. And I think we should really push hard against that sort of a language. So certainly I think as a result of 9/11, we got the Patriot Act passed. We have sort of, in many ways, far fewer civil liberties than we had before. And so had we had the technology to detect and stop 9/11 before it happened, that would have been a very good thing from a civil liberties perspective. So I think that's like very big picture. And certainly as a libertarian, if you ever had a nuclear bomb go off in a city in the U.S., I mean, this would be the end of all civil liberties in this country, period. And so I think it is really imperative for us to try to find ways to prevent these things from happening actively before they happen. On a more granular level, I always think of the definition of technology. Technology is doing more with less. And so in this national security context, you could define technology as more security with less privacy invasion. And so that's what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have technology, when you do not innovate, then you end up with the debate of, well, we have more security, but you get less privacy, or we have more privacy and you have less security. You get more of one or less of the other, and it's only when we develop better technologies that you avoid this sort of trade-off, and that's why we need to develop them. And certainly, I think a lot of the responses that have happened have been, I would say, have been extraordinarily low-tech, where I'm not sure the airport security measures we have, they're sort of minimal security, lots of privacy trade-offs. There probably are ways we get a little bit more privacy, much less security. So I think it's worth thinking really hard about how to get this trade-off right. There's sort of all these libertarian critiques of the NSA as Big Brother and sort of having, and I think it's the more accurate critique of the NSA is that it's more like the Keystone Cops, where it's sort of the first thing a spy agency is supposed to do is counterintelligence. It's supposed to figure out, is there anybody inside the spy agency who's spying on them? If you have somebody in the IT department downloading all the files, that normally gets people's attention. This would never happen even in a Facebook, Google, any Silicon Valley company. This would never happen. And then once somebody had downloaded all the files, and you said, okay, they ran away to Russia, and what did they take? You'd be able to figure that out really quickly. And I think one way to think about the evolution of what's happened with things like the NSA is that because they know they're not that good at figuring out what's going on, there's constantly this sort of bureaucratic push to get more and more and more data. Should we be listening to Angela Merkel's cell phone calls? I don't know. I strongly suspect it was news to Obama that we were doing that. I'm sure he hadn't gotten transcript of this or anything. And so I think we just have this process where you hoover up all this data all over the world, but you don't know what to do with it.
Okay, other questions? Where's the microphone? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Peter, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today. My name is Blake Hall, and along with Matt Thompson here, we co-founded ID.me, and we're essentially trying to do for identity what you did for currency with PayPal. The idea being that citizens don't have a way to assert their identity to another party through like the online equivalent of a driver's license, nor could you say take your reputation on eBay over to Craigslist and prove that you're a trusted seller or buyer in a transaction. So we're providing credentials that do that across the network. Last year, we were given a $3 million grant by the Department of Commerce for part of the President's National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace to make online transactions more secure. I would love to get your thoughts on the future of digital identity, how you think it's going to evolve, and the role that the government plays in the evolution of that ecosystem, certainly as a traditional credentialing body through the DMVs and even through like the IRS could attest that you're an accredited investor, for instance, but citizens can't access that data today. So without going too deep into the weeds, I would just love to get your thoughts on how digital identity will look like in the future.
Don't have any really strong thoughts on this off the top. I tend to think I'm skeptical of the idea that there's going to be some complex coordinated process where the government will figure this out across the board. And what's probably worth exploring is, are there some very specific versions, like maybe there's a state where the DMV actually works really well. I'm not sure which one that would be, but maybe there's some specific version where something like this can happen. I think you always, for the adoption of a new technology, it's always necessary. It's rarely enough to have something that's slightly better for lots of people. I think it's often much more critical for it to be intensely better for some small number of people to at least get the initial adoption going. And so I think one of the questions is always, how can one do this in this sort of identity security space? If you take surveys on this, people will say they'd like this, but in practice, I think it's always a question, how intense is the demand for it that would really drive consumer behavior to change.
Okay, other questions? Oh.
Hi, Will Reiner with the American Action Forum. Excuse my naivete because I haven't read the book yet. It's actually next on my list. But you mentioned the 1970s as an inflection point, which has been a huge kind of point that a number of other economists, specifically Tyler Cowen, has talked about as part of the stagnation model. And he has said that essentially, that it isn't just the United States. It's basically all of the Western world has really had this downtick, and it's been an inflection point essentially in the 1970s with total factor productivity. So it seems to me that the entire conversation at this point is something along the lines of, innovation at the frontier is very, very, very costly, as we've seen in a number of different contexts. So do you think it is that innovation is costly, or do you think that there's other restrictions? I mean, you've talked about the government. We've here people obviously in the policy realm are very interested in the government, but do you think it's something that is just a structural point, and that we need to get our policies right to make sure that we're at the upper bounds of that, or is it actually something that is being caused by outside forces?
Well, I think so. I do think I am sympathetic to the stagnation thesis. I actually gave Tyler sort of the idea for it, so he dedicated his Great Stagnation book to me because I sort of had given him the idea for it 7-8 years ago. And I think I do think there was something that really slowed down in the 1970s. The question of what caused it, we've already had it was change in the military, change in the culture, more risk averse, more egalitarian. You have government regulations and all sorts of other areas. I think the stagnation is probably very overdetermined. So I think it's actually there probably are like a whole set of different things that have gone into it, and it's probably a mistake to sort of think of one single overarching thing that's really big. I think one of the big things that happened in the 70s was we had these oil shocks, and in some sense, if you look at the oil prices today, we still have not recovered from the oil shocks of the 70s. And so I think the question of innovation in energy specifically is always an extremely important one, and it should be measured by how much cheaper the energy is getting, and that's sort of the fundamentalist market perspective I would have is I'm going to measure progress in energy not by what people say, but are the prices going down? And they've actually not yet been going down, even with the enormous fracking revolution of the last few years. I think one place where there's sort of a left versus right dichotomy on this stagnation thing, and I think we should be doing more on the center right to own this issue, is Larry Summers has started to articulate a version of this secular stagnation thesis, but on the left it's always being articulated from the demand side, and so it's the credit system is broken, people are have less demand of one sort or another. And I think the real cause for the stagnation is on the supply side, and we need to be focusing on it as a supply side problem, that we're not creating the new technologies, we're not creating a supply of new goods, and that's what's driving the stagnation. I think there's no demand problem whatsoever. People in this country are drenched with advertising. They're spending way more money than they should be. They should be saving way more than they're saving. So you're out of your mind if you think we have a demand problem in this country. We have a supply problem, and it's a supply side problem, and we need to reframe the secular stagnation as fundamentally a problem of supply.
Great. One question over here.
Peter, David Fenstermaker with Raymond James, and thank you for just a really nice talk. I just want to sort of circle around at that issue of stagnation and look at monetary policy and the idea that you're pushing demand forward and to try to get the economy going. You've lowered interest rates, and that's been great for the people in the money business or people like yourself who have money. For the 80 to 90% of the people who aren't there, who don't participate enough in that, and all they see is perhaps that their bank no longer provides them any interest. You have sort of a dichotomy here, and you say you're trying to increase demand, but what you've really done is take the air out of the room for 90% of the public. And my perception is we've been trying to manipulate monetary policy for some end for so long that the medicine doesn't work, and it's actually destroying demand because people don't have any sense of cushion. They don't get any return on their savings, and they need to save more, but the whole system is manipulated by government. Your response?
Let's see. So I share, I think, the general critique where I think we've been doing too much QE in this country. If I had to replay it, I think maybe there was an argument for the first two rounds of QE in 2009 and 2010 when you had enormous volatility, and there was something to be said for trying to dampen down the volatility. QE Infinity, which started in fall of 2012, just in time for the presidential election, was probably completely unnecessary. There was no volatility left in the markets. The spreads had been narrowed. And so I think that was wildly excessive, what we've had over the last year and a half. I do think that the problem is not primarily on the level of monetary policy, though. So even though I'd be in favor of a slightly more restrictive policy, I think the main issues are all these micro-regulatory issues. And when we abstract it on the level of monetary policy, I wonder if we're sort of falling into the mistake to think that it's all about the manipulation of money versus what the money stands for in the underlying economy. And so, I think it was this line I think Bloomberg had a year ago where there was no shortage of money. You could just print an infinite amount if you had to. And obviously that's true, but kind of irrelevant as well, because the question is not how much money can you print in a fiat system. It's what does the money stand for in the underlying economy. And it's this sort of dualist system where we have a world of bits, a world of money where you can print infinite amounts, but on the world of atoms, we're not producing enough. that's the disconnect we should overcome. I don't think we should go back to a gold standard, but I think one of the virtues of the gold standard was that it always maintained this link between goods in the economy and the monetary system, where there was scarcity in the real economy, and there's this fundamental scarcity to money, and so there's this natural mapping between money and the underlying economy. And I think that's sort of a frame we should always come back to. The core problem is always, how do you overcome scarcity? And we obscure that problem by shifting the debate onto the level of monetary policy. And we should always be thinking about, how do you overcome scarcity? And I think the much larger issues are all these micro-regulatory things. It's like zoning laws. You can't change your house even one tiny bit in San Francisco, where I live. All these sort of things that you just can't do. And that's the kind of stuff we should be focusing on much more.
I had one question.
Oh, yeah.
Peter, Mike Galvin from Harrison Street Capital. I was wondering where you think leadership and innovation is likely to originate in the future. Will America and the West continue to lead, albeit at a diminished pace, or do you see other countries or cultures beginning to catch up to or surpass America and the West in terms of technological and business leadership, innovation?
So I think the U.S. is still very much in the lead in this. This is, in some ways, it is. I would say the business model of the U.S. is that this is the country where people do new things, and this is sort of our comparative advantage relative to the rest of the world. People come here to do new things. It was a frontier society, and I think we're still, in many ways, at the frontier of innovation. It's certainly, and so to the extent we lose that, I think we lose something very essential about the character of this country, and we should really try to resist that. I don't see competition for innovation per se emerging that quickly in the developing world. So I think in places like China, all you need to do is copy things that already work. You don't, there's so much low-hanging fruit by just copying things that work. You don't really need to innovate. The place where you need to do new things are in the so-called developed world, US, Western Europe, Japan, and I think that's the place where people need to be doing more, and that's the place where I look to invest. So it's Israel, Scandinavia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, US. It's the developed world where we need to do more, and I always think we should, the developing dichotomy that we use for describing the world is a pro-globalization dichotomy. The developing world will copy the developed world and will sort of converge, but it's also an anti-technology dichotomy, because when we say that we're living in the developed world, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world which is done, finished, nothing new is going to happen, it's stagnant. The younger generations that should have lower expectations than their parents, and I think that's something we should push against really hard. And we should always come back to asking this question: how do we go about developing the developed world? And we should not accept this notion that we're living in a developed nation.
Speaking of China, what do you think of Alibaba at $93 a share?
I think it's
Or whatever
down a
it
little
is.
bit today.
I don't know what it is now.
Well, I think China thinks of the internet in a way very different from the US. They think of information technology as somewhat less important than we do economically and more important politically. And so these companies they're fundamentally political investments. They're protected by the government. They will not face competition from Western companies. And investment in Alibaba is fundamentally a bet on Jack Ma staying in the good graces of the Chinese Communist Party. I suspect that's a good bet, but it's not the sort of thing, not the sort of place where I feel I have a comparative advantage in evaluating.
Okay, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last question. In a very good article in the Telegraph, the British newspaper, it says that almost the first thing you do when introduced is to ask what are the three most interesting things the person you're introduced to has encountered in the last year. So let me ask that of you. And you can limit it to one.
There's always so much in this category. I'm trying to think of a really good,
Well, you can go for 3 if you want.
good example off the top, but there are all these, and I think one of the things that is actually very inspiring about Silicon Valley generally, we have all these sort of ways we're often pessimistic about some of these trends, but there is actually a lot that is still happening. There are a lot of really great ideas out there. It's always tricky how they're hard to implement, why they don't quite translate in the ways in which they seemingly should be able to. But when you actually look at the underlying things, there are sort of a lot of really cool things. We've been looking. We've been looking a lot at sort of some of the biotech areas. There's one company that we've invested in. They're still sort of in this quasi-stealth mode, but it looks like they've come up with a whole platform approach to curing a whole set of cancers that have not yet been cured, and we'll see if the early results hold up. But it was sort of this very methodical approach that is sort of slightly different paradigm, and they sort of pull all the details together. And so there's things like that you see enough of, and this is sort of the indomitability of the human spirit always gives you hope for the future.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I always think when I got to Silicon Valley, it's just it's a way to kind of recharge your batteries, and I think that that's something that people in Washington should be doing all the time, or maybe AEI should open up a branch, or move the whole thing there, David. I don't know. Thank you so much, Peter. This has been fabulous. Peter is, as I said, will sign books. This is the first in a series, which we will continue to call Disruptors, although we'll probably have like a little footnote. We don't mean that kind of disruptor. And next is October 8th. October 8th is Jeff Pulver, the great voice-over internet protocol pioneer. And then November 6th is Walter Isaacson talking about his new book about Silicon Valley. Again, thank you so much, Peter Thiel.